Hello.
Hi there.
All right. So, Andrew Aversa, developer of Tangledeep, traditional roguelike for PC and Nintendo Switch. Though he considers himself a full-time programmer and designer, his background is in music production and composition, where he made a career for over 10 years before pursuing a lifelong dream of making games, which I think is very interesting.
Thank you.
And also, yeah, Tangledeep, fantastic game. I'm sure that there are a lot of Tangledeep fans in the chat.
Yeah, thank you for having me again. Last time I was here was 2018 in person, of course, but pleasure to be back.
Yeah. All right. Take it away.
All right. So that introduction basically covered everything I want to say about myself, except for the fact that so this talk, which I intentionally named to be ever so slightly clickbaity, the end of Permadeath. This is not going to be about Tangledeep at all. So if you're hoping to hear about just Tangledeep, unfortunately, it won't be that. But it will be about a topic that I care very much about. So the reactions that I was expecting when I made that title, I'm sure people were wondering what it would be about. So I want to give an outline of sort of what I'm hoping to cover and what I'm also not really covering. So this isn't a topic about is permadeath good or bad, because I think that is completely subjective and it's just not inside the scope of this. It's also not really about accessibility or difficulty. I talked about that actually in 2018 and sort of about balance and roguelikes and how that is a very unique challenge. And I also don't really want to get into the nature of what a roguelike is. For the sake of this talk, it's not super pertinent because I'm talking about a specific mechanic, even though that mechanic is core to many roguelikes. There are certainly games that use it that we would not consider roguelikes, and there are classic ones that don't rely on permadeath that we definitely do consider roguelikes. So what this is sort of an evaluation and a high-level view of how permadeath changes how we design games, developers, how players play the games, and how we shape their expectations, and how their expectations could either be met or how we could fail to meet them, and how it's a tricky thing, but we can see, and I'll go into some of the permadeath optional games, how they've done it, alternatives, and sort of how that all shakes out ultimately. So you might be thinking, for Lynn interpretation, wait a second, like you take out permadeath, it's not a roguelike anymore. But no, it really doesn't matter. This is something that people really want to talk about, even in our roguelikes. I frequent that subreddit quite a bit, and you can see I made this little collage just of different topics that I saw. People saying, I want to play roguelikes without permadeath. Is it necessary? Permadeath is bad. I hate permadeath. Is it wrong of me to hate permadeath? And I thought it was just sort of funny in the bottom right. I had a couple topics that came up. This save scumming, in defense of save scumming. So save scumming is sort of interesting because it's like, oh, your game doesn't have permadeath optional. Well, I'm going to make it optional. And it sort of speaks to what I'm talking about here, which is how players' expectations and how the options you present can have a big impact on the ultimate experience. So first, where is permadeath optional? What kind of games? And I was as surprised as maybe you might be looking at this, that there are actually quite a few games, both in the traditional canon and certainly new releases as well, where it's optional. Sometimes it's the default that there is actually no permadeath. In particular, Stone Shard was one that really caught my attention because that is a fairly major kind of newcomer, I guess, in terms of the age of roguelikes in general. Stone Shard is a game that has just absolutely blown up on Steam. It's made an enormous impact as an indie game for a game that permadeath is optional in. And I believe that it is currently not the default. I'm sure things could change. It's early access. Things are shifting around, but all these other games, they're from small to large, roguelites potentially, all have varying degrees. It ends up being a spectrum, which I'll get into. There's a spectrum of ways permadeath is optional and a spectrum of ways that is perceived by players. So I want to define this a little bit first. What do I mean by optional permadeath? So this was the best definition I could come up with. Any mode or option where the player is not necessarily doomed to lose all their progress upon dying. So the implications of this definition are that there could be situations where you do die permanently. It doesn't mean death is just like on or off and it's a binary. You could lose some of your progress, like maybe you lose all of your weapons or experience, but you keep your weapons or something in between. There could be some kind of a buffer, like a life system or saves or rewinds or checkpoints where it's permanent in the sense that that particular point in time is lost. It's a dead end, but you can go back to an earlier point. The point is that it doesn't mean there's no penalty. So when I talk about optional permadeath, it does not mean that there's no penalty. And it doesn't mean that the option is default or prominent or hidden. That is its own thing, which I'm about to get into, which is how this is presented, how we define the default experience of a game as developers is monumentally important and will drastically affect how the game is perceived. This is true not just for games, not just for options in games, but really just in general human psychology. This has been studied at great length by other people. A classic example is actually organ donation, which is a very serious topic, but they've looked at countries that have similar cultures and similar people, and they've looked at the rates of organ donation when it was opt-in. In other words, you are not an organ donor by default, and you have to specifically say, yes, I want to be one, versus opt-out. You're signed up by default, and you have to specifically say, no, I don't want that. And if all things were equal, and if people were 100% rational, and the brains worked very differently, then those rates should be, it shouldn't matter whether it's opt-in or opt-out if it's the same general population. But in fact, as you might guess, the opposite is true, and it has an enormous impact on how people behave. So simply by how we present these options, we're already setting the stage for how people might play a game. And this is before we even get into the implementation of these options, the difficulty of the game, the balance, forget all of that. We're just talking about the title screen and character creation. So I think there are a few ways that the permadeath option, whether it's something like a hardcore mode in Diablo that is on or off, or whether it's switching the number of lives you have, the way that that can be displayed can be split up into a few different categories. So one is that there are no options at the very beginning. You start the game, and the only way to either enable or disable a permadeath mode is by using some sort of console or going into a settings menu accessible only after character creation. This is the strongest statement that we can make as a developer to say, this is the way you play our game. And anything else is just, that's not really the intended experience. A pre-selected toggle is like a big psychological like nudge to somebody to say, well, here's the default. We're highlighting it. It's in big text. And there are other things on the screen, maybe at the same time or in a drop down. But again, it is a fairly big indicator that that's what you should be doing. You can nestle, I guess that's the way I would put it, nestle the option where you have to go to a separate screen. Let's say character creation, there's like a little cog in the bottom left or bottom right corner, or a submenu that you don't have to pass through. So you could put many options in there. Many games do. We'll get into some examples, but obviously that is significantly downplaying the importance of that option. And then hidden would be, there basically isn't any option. The only way you can possibly access it is by editing game files, by save scumming, and that is the developer saying, no, you just cannot do this. And if you want to do it, like, to have at it, edit the code, edit the memory, whatever. And then finally, the most equitable option, I guess, to all of the different modes that you might be offering, such as a permadeath on or off, is an equal selection. So you show option A, B, C, either in a vertical list, horizontal list, and nothing is pre-highlighted. You have to like hover over what you want and click on it. So there, I mean, aside from like maybe your eye is drawn to the left or the center of the screen just because of the way the text was rendered, generally speaking, this will probably provide the most even results. If people see three options in front of them and they're not highlighted in a particular way, then they'll probably evaluate them roughly evenly. So here are some examples. These are not all roguelikes or even RPGs, but this is just to illustrate the point. So both Wolfenstein and Doom, they have difficulties sort of laid out like this. So while they show everything on the screen at the same time, the way they label things obviously tells the player, okay, this is not the real mode. Don't play this. If you play this, like, you're weak. We only just kind of threw that in there. The opposite, I didn't get a screenshot of this, but there are games that have something like normal mode, hard mode, story mode. And story mode is like literally the complete opposite of this screen here, where you're saying, well, we don't think any less of you for picking this mode. And if you pick it, it's because you want to focus on the story and not the difficulty, and that's fine. Celeste is an example of a game where this is a nestled menu. So they have a wonderful assist mode, wonderful options for players that are not interested in sort of the traditional mode. And in fact, this is like the ultimate permadeath off in a way. Not that the game has true permadeath, but you can literally just say you cannot die, invincibility. But in order to get to this menu, you have to pass through like essentially a warning screen that says, we're about to show you some options. We recommend you play the game as it is first, but if you want, here are your options. So they're not hidden, but it's definitely dissuading the player from picking these things. And then here's ADOM. And here I think is a fairly equitable presentation where somebody could look at standard mode and hard mode. Those are the first two things your eyes would be drawn to. And roguelike mode is not the one at the top. And if somebody doesn't want to play a harder experience, then having that labeling is beneficial. And it's also beneficial to people that do want that experience. So this is like a very equitable way of saying you can play it either way. It's fine. And also what I thought was interesting, I'm not sure if this was a bug or not, but I was watching a streamer play this as a recording, and he had picked standard mode, but then it started him in this. It said, this is the best mode to get accustomed to the game. And in the text there, it says, if you feel more comfortable, if you feel comfortable with it, you can progress to like classic mode, the real mode. So it's a developer statement, a literal statement written in text. So this is one way to communicate your intentions to the player and set their expectation for what you intend for them to be playing. So I keep talking about expectations. What does that actually mean? And this is where I get into these weird shapes. And basically what these are on the y-axis, we have the amount of time the player has put into the game in a single run. So from early game to late game, at the very top, you've beaten the game. And then the x-axis is the amount of content. Content, we can very broadly define it. Just options for characters, gear, monsters, layouts, maps. And so when you have permadeath, and that is the default mode, and this is what people expect, you are basically guaranteeing that early content is going to be seen over and over and over and over. You're making a promise to the player that you are going to die, and so we are going to make, as developers, a wide variety of content for you at the beginning of the game. We're going to give you different starting points, monster types, locations, maybe all sorts of interesting creation options in the character creator. And if we don't do that, if we don't hold up our side of the bargain, and you're coming in expecting a permadeath experience, and we give you the same 5 floors in the same layout, monsters, even if it's procedurally generated, if it ends up being just samey, people will get bored. They might even leave a negative review. That's bad. And it also has this side implication of the story. And it's saying, if you're going to be playing this early game repeatedly, then we can't really make an intrusive story. And when I say intrusive, I don't mean to downplay the existence of story in games in general. I mean to contrast it with like a JRPG style game, or even a traditional cinematic game where you start the game, there's a 5-minute sequence before you actually get to control your character. Obviously, if you're going to die a lot and see the beginning of the game a lot, even the most amazing opening in cinematic and setup is going to become very stale very quickly. So we're saying we can't really have a traditional sort of cinematic story approach. Without permadeath, we're kind of making the exact opposite promise. We're saying that you probably are not spending much time in the early game. Why would you? Because if your character is not going to die, or it's hard, or it's rare, you will be well past that. You're going to breeze past that, and you're going to be into the mid game. And in fact, there's a question of, are you guaranteed to reach the end game? If we think again to more traditional RPGs, aside from things where you could have such a vexing puzzle that you cannot proceed, people usually expect, like, yeah, I'm going to be able to beat the game. Maybe I have to grind, but yeah, I'll get to the end. And so that brings up player expectations of, well, the final boss better be good. There better be a lot of options at the end. Like, I want to gear up my character. I want to go to fight hidden bosses. In the case of a very loot-driven game, which many roguelikes are, and many roguelike derivatives, we might expect there to be some kind of gear treadmill. I know that's a little bit of a pejorative term, but just the sense of, like, I want to keep getting upgrades. And this is a problem that even very big games have to grapple with, is like, well, what do you do in the end game or even the post game? Story also is probably going to be a little bit more of an expectation. If you invest all this time and you explore a bigger and bigger world with all this interesting stuff, and there's no story or payoff, it might come off as a little weird. Even games that are not necessarily super story driven, example being the Diablo series, Diablo 3 was sort of maligned a little bit because the story didn't go the way a lot of people expected that it would. Diablo is not a default permadeath game, so it's something where you expect to see the full story, and if it doesn't deliver, it's like, well, I'm disappointed now. Can you design for both? Can you make something where it's just like an equal width? It's not a pyramid at all. It's just like a straight line. So this is possible. The thing is, we're all human. We have 24 hours in the day. We don't have big budgets. We're roguelike developers. So, of course, it's not really going to be possible to put maximum effort and time and money into every single stage of the game. We have to make some decisions and concessions. And it can make things harder when you're trying to balance and weigh both exactly equally. Something that may be perfectly acceptable in a non-permadeath mode, like, oh, this monster hits for half your HP. Okay, that might be fine, or in an invisible trap. Some people might say that is completely unfair. And as I was doing this, I had to cut some content here just because of the length of the talk. But if you look at reviews for many roguelikes, you will see sometimes people are like, this was very unfair. Like the way you died, the way you die or tend to die, like, this is unfair. I didn't see this coming. I lost my progress and I'm mad, and I leave a negative review. Yes, they're salty, but the point is that depending on how the developer was thinking about this, were they thinking about it like, oh, they're not going to have permadeath on, and so it's not a big issue? We don't necessarily know, but the point is that if it doesn't align with what people are expecting, then it becomes a very tricky thing to do, a tricky line that you have to balance on. And so here are some examples of some reviews that I pulled of different roguelike games. These are traditional roguelikes. I'm not saying which one was which, but this is to show completely different expectations that people have. So the first one, the summary is that playing it without permadeath on is awesome. There's always new things to do. Permadeath on is fun until you realize that you have to go through this early game slog again to get back to where you were. So this is somebody that feels like this game did not meet their expectations when permadeath was on, but they loved it when permadeath was off. It's interesting. Maybe should permadeath have even been an option if the game was designed that way? Or maybe the design should have been adjusted. The next one, somebody was saying, there's this awesome endgame, but why do I have to play 13 hours of the game to get to that part? So a similar complaint, basically saying that it was boring and they just wanted to get to sort of like the fun stuff. So maybe the fun stuff should have just been put at the beginning. Now here we have something that's the complete opposite. I honestly find the early game harder and more engaging, but the further you go, it's more just like patience and preparation. And so they're saying, well, I'd rather just spend all my time in the early game. So this is somebody that really would prefer a very straightforward permadeath experience. They want to see that and see that rich content at the beginning. And once again, going back to the opposite, if something's not fun and its only purpose is to reach the second part, why not remove it? And then finally, this was a paraphrase because I actually couldn't find exactly where I read this, but somebody was saying the first half is where all the fun happens. And by the end, my gear and my strategy always converges. It's basically saying that it got too thin and squeezed by the end. And it's an interesting thing there because maybe If the game had been designed differently, or if they had presented their options differently, that player might have had a different expectation. If they had said, well, if they had adjusted the difficulty such that it's very, very, very unlikely you'll actually get to the end game, then that 1 in 50 times where you actually do, rather than feeling like, oh, I'm so bored, like, okay, I'm just using the same strategy I always do, versus like, oh man, I made it to the end game. This is crazy. Like, I can't believe I'm here. That's two different experiences. So what are some of the alternatives? How are developers playing with this concept of permadeath on and off, and how does it sort of affect things? How does each one affect the player experience? So the most simple option, and I just gave some examples of each, it's not an exhaustive list, but having just a permadeath off option is sort of the simplest approach. Like, you die and then you lose some resources and that's it. Like, you will get to the end of the game. You can't permanently lose. So all of these games shown have this kind of option. Then there's a life system, which is an interesting compromise because it's giving you a buffer. You might have to adjust the way you play somewhat, but it gives the designer a lot more room to say, like, yes, we can do a few unfair things. We can sort of push the limits a little bit of what might be considered fair, but we can also open up new rewards. So maybe you're willing to do this incredibly risky thing to get a cool sword because you only die once doing it, but you don't want to necessarily do that every time you see a cool reward because you only have 5 lives or 6 or whatever. Also, the lives themselves can be cool rewards. Then you have like a wizard mode, which is basically just saying, look, we don't care. We're going to make it possible to do this and disable permadeath, but it's just like a cheat code. So whatever. Or the reverse, like you can turn it on, but it's saying, hey, we have no guarantee that this is going to be fun. Like, have at it. A save system is also another interesting compromise, sort of like lives, because like with a classic computer RPG, like Western RPG or a JRPG, you might have the option of saving anytime, or you might have only the option of saving at checkpoints, like inns or literal like rotating save points. But this is not necessarily easier than permadeath off or lives, because you could potentially save the game in a situation where you cannot recover. So you could be deep in a dungeon and you have no scrolls of return or whatever, and you save your game and you don't have enough healing items, and that save file can be potentially doomed. And this may actually be more frustrating depending on how you design your game and the exit and return options, because if the player feels like it's an impossible puzzle, it's like walking into a room and the door locks behind you and you're just going to like starve to death kind of thing, where it's not fun. It's not a fun and heroic and valiant way of dying. It's just like, oh, well, I guess I have to start a new file then. But it does have other benefits as well, which is that it's somewhere between having literally no permadeath and having it as the default thing that just always happens when you die. So basically, in conclusion, people have very strong feelings about permadeath. Even people that are roguelike fans posting on roguelike forums and subreddits, like, these are fans, right? But they are still interested in exploring options. But the thing is, how we present those options is going to really affect their expectations when they play the game. Also, a problem for developers is that these sort of rules or modes of play can actually cause us to completely allocate our resources differently. So we have to very carefully think about where we're going to put our development time, our content. I know a lot of roguelike developers feel like content is almost the least fun part. Like, we like messing around with map generators and procedural conversations and all this fun stuff. And then content is like, just, do that later. So we have to really think about that. But also that there's a lot of different ways it can be implemented that can feel just as difficult. And in some cases, again, can actually doom the player without literally having you're dead, files erased immediately. And we should also think, I guess, this is, if I had to say one point, is that as developers, we should think about why we are including permadeath in our game. And if we're willing to fulfill the promise that permadeath is sort of stating to the player. Are you ready to promise that early game is going to be fun, that you're not going to have a story that's going to be too heavy for the beginning, that you're going to have enough variation in character creation? if you're thinking to yourself, I want to make this RPG and I want to have like, fighting dragons on a neutron star, that's like the experience I want to promise. You might want to think about maybe permadeath should not be the default, because you want people to get to that point of epic cosmic battles sooner rather than later. So thus ends the talk. Happy to take any questions. Thank you for watching and having me back. And of course, you can always email me at the address up there on the screen.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I have to say that the chat was popping off.
Oh boy.
It's certainly a interesting topic. People have a lot of opinions about permadeath and a lot of different comparisons from other games. Your clickbait strategy.
Clickbait? What do you call that?
Yeah, it worked very well. There's a lot of feelings, but a lot of good ones in terms of comparing different games. So the first ranked question is, how do you feel about meta progression and how it relates to permadeath?
Oh, well, so that is one, I talked about that a little bit in my talk 2 years ago. That's why I didn't really want to retread it too much, but
right.
I guess
watch that talk is the answer.
Sure. But I will say just very, very briefly that is another way of sort of bridging the gap a little bit between the two options. If you want to say like, I really, really want to balance around just permadeath in terms of like the feeling of danger, but I don't want to scare off the people that are might be discouraged by dying so often, having such a difficult experience. And I think that there's definitely a lot of implementations of meta progress as well that can make people either feel frustrated, like I have to die to build up my character, versus, oh, this is cool. Meta progress, I get like more options. Like, wow, now I'm actually kind of like excited. Even if I die, I get to pick another starting location. Cool. So it can go either way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another question that's more like an idea to get your thoughts of from R. Brady is, what do you think about user choice at death of, is this the end of your story? At that point, giving a choice to the user.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. I think I'd have to think about that a little more. I actually don't have a reaction right away. Yeah.
Throw a design problem at you live on stage.
Yeah, no, that's one that I don't think I can give an immediate reaction to.
Well, I guess people can try and email you and find you later to get your thoughts.
Yeah, we'll talk about that more.
We probably have time for one more question from Darren Gray. Some people talk about this as perma-failure or permanent consequence instead of permadeath, making it no different from board games where mistakes matter. Any thoughts on this framing?
Permanent
consequence.
Right, permanent consequence. Yeah, I guess I think it's definitely like an expectation thing, right? It's just like what you're saying, the framing expectations. It's two sides of the same coin. So if you're presenting something as like, yes, you have to, you might die a lot, but you're going to gain experience as a player, and this is part of the experience. So the consequences are relatively unimportant for any single run. That's okay. Also, I think the length of the play session can also change a little bit, both the framing from the developer and the player. If your average run is like 10 to 15 hours versus more of a coffee break roguelike, that's definitely going to change the way people feel when they get spiked for like 80% of their health later in the game. And board games are certainly on the very short end of that spectrum.
Though arguably permanent consequence in something like Monopoly is part of why that game is terrible to play. Hot take.
Also true. Yep.
Yeah. Interesting. Sure. Well, excellent. Thank you so much. There's some other questions, unfortunately, we don't have time for, because yes, very topic that brings about a lot of conversation. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, and hopefully people can try and find you and have some more discussion about that later.
Yes, I would love to. All right.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.